Welcome back into the Lions247 Podcast. I am Tyler Donahue, and we've got a lot to discuss on this episode. In just a moment, Mark Brennan and Daniel Gallen will join the conversation. We were all on the practice field on Wednesday afternoon into Wednesday evening. A bunch of content over at Lions247.com. We have notebooks breaking down what we witnessed on offense, on defense. We have a full photo gallery from both sides of the ball. We have video highlights, about 3-minute package that Mark put together from all across the field. We've got video of James Franklin's entire post-practice press conference, along with video of Andy Kotelnicki's post-practice press conference. And all that can be found at Lions247.com. A lot more content coming your way. But we're in the final days of spring ball now. We'll be back in Beaver Stadium on Saturday morning, preparing for a 2 p.m. start time to the annual blue-white game. And to help break that down and discuss what we learned from the practice field yesterday, we welcome in Daniel Gallen and Mark Brennan. Been a 5-week process of 15 spring practices. 13 of them have been logged. We saw number 13 on Wednesday. They'll practice again Friday, and then they'll wrap things up in Beaver Stadium on Saturday. Good to get you back both on board. And before we go further, we have a ton to discuss about players, about positions, but this is the last day. I've been promoting it for the entire month, going back to March. The deals that we have going on, 2 different paths to take advantage of at Lions247.com in case you are not yet a subscriber. I'm going to hand the mic over to Mark Brennan to get us started here, and he's going to hammer it home one more time because that deal ends Thursday at midnight. So if you're listening on Friday, I'm sorry. You waited a bit too long. I've been telling you twice a week for the last month.
Yeah, it's a great deal. I mean, if 50% off is awesome for a year. I mean, if you think about what that comes out to per month or per day, it's pennies per day. So it's definitely worth doing. But if you're not ready to take that leap, the ability to get 1 month for $1, we're basically saying pay $1 because we have to have you pay something to get you into the system. We can't just do it for free. It's just not technically feasible for us to do that. And let us prove it. And I think if you go back and look at the coverage we've had over the past month, you know, from team coverage, and obviously a big part of what our VIP coverage is the great job Tyler Calvaruso, Brian Doan, and everybody else do. You guys putting together outstanding VIP notes off of practice and our VIP message board community. There's a lot of free stuff on the site, but a lot of the best discussion and the best coverage is the VIP level. So I don't know how else to explain it other than give us a shot. We'll prove it. We'll continue to prove it after spring practice. We're not stopping. Things are going to keep going. So yeah, I mean, I would hop in if you have the opportunity. 50% off for an annual pass, or the $1 for 1 month test drive. Tyler, as you mentioned, for people who are listening to this Friday, sorry you missed out, but we'll still have some sort of deal going, maybe 30% off or something. But if you're getting ready for the blue-white game, now is a great time to jump on board at a value price.
And a reminder, the blue-white game, we'll break down some of what that structure format will look like on Saturday later on this episode, but we do know it will not be televised. Last year was on Big Ten Network. This year, if you want to follow along step-by-step, learn who's standing out, learn what we're seeing from personnel packages, Lions247.com VIP subscription is going to get it done for you. Without that VIP subscription, you'll be able to see some of the content, but you really won't be as engaged or as informed as you could be. And again, if it's $1 for 1 month, to set yourself up for one of the most anticipated Penn State football seasons on the record, it's a great time to take the plunge. And
big recruiting weekend too, guys.
Yeah,
I mean, it's another big recruiting weekend. It's been one after another after another.
Yeah, we saw recruits all across the practice field yesterday. There's been a couple commitments that have come on board in the last week. Tyler Calvaruso was on with us, our last episode of this podcast, which dropped on Tuesday, breaking down those additions. So a lot of moving parts. And, oh, by the way, the transfer portal spring window doesn't close until tomorrow. So there's room for two-way street, I guess you could say, in terms of Penn State's roster, and we'll have you updated with that. Now that our last sales pitch for that promotion is aside, we have some injury updates to get to, and some that maybe we weren't anticipating to be able to pass along by the end of spring camp. And we'll begin with Nolan Rucci, who started 5 games at right tackle last season, including the entire playoff run for Penn State, performed very well. Pro Football Focus had him among the most highly rated playoff participants on the offensive line, regardless of who they were playing for, and a lot of expectations for what he may be able to accomplish as a fifth-year senior, year 2 with the Nittany Lions. He was not available for the start of spring practice. James Franklin didn't go into details on that earlier. He did talk about it this week, said it was a nagging issue more than any kind of big deal, we knew confidently that Nolan Rucci was going to be checked back in by the time preseason camp rolled around, ready to engage in that competition again. But there he was, Daniel. You were keeping tabs on the offense on Wednesday, and Nolan Rucci there working a little bit at right tackle. It was individual work, according to James Franklin. They're glad to get him some work late in spring ball. Would have loved to have gotten him more, but this is a nice encouraging sign about what lies ahead on the offensive line.
Yeah, there's an element when you get to the fourth week of spring ball and you don't see someone out there yet. You kind of resign yourself to not seeing them out there. You can just kind of be like, this guy's a vet. We've seen enough of him. It's this late. It wouldn't be a surprise if we don't see him again. And so it's to see Rucci out there. I think that's a good sign. We'd heard earlier from James Franklin this spring that it wasn't necessarily anything serious, and he called it something nagging last night. So Rucci's healthy and back out there, and I think that's a positive. He was running as that second team right tackle with Javen Williams, still getting those reps with the ones, which is going to be a fun storyline to take into the offseason. But yeah, I think it's good to see Rucci back out there, and the more healthy offensive linemen that you have, the better.
6'8", bigger than he's been at any point in his college career, handling some confidence right now after accruing a bunch of reps. Remember, he played about 70 total snaps during his career at Wisconsin, former 5-star recruit. We're still waiting for Anthony Donko to get back to be full go. Again, expect that to happen come August. Those two battled it out last summer. Donko was the initial nod, though we saw Rucci get involved as a rotational piece, and that paid off when he had to step up because of Donko's November injury. And as you mentioned, Javen Williams has been the beneficiary this spring, getting loaded up with right tackle reps. I think we should note here that just because Rucci comes back to the practice field doesn't mean that we'll see him involved on Saturday. There are varying limitations for guys on the field right now, and depending on what period they're involved in. And so just because we saw some guys return, we saw Caleb Artis, a defensive tackle that we hadn't seen this spring. He was back on the field in uniform, but we don't know that we'll definitely see them involved on Saturday because of what their capacity is right now. And the name that also popped up from an injury standpoint was Cam Wallace on Wednesday. Talk about somebody that really wasn't on our radar for right now. We're kind of seeing where he would be later in the year. And he was out there on the practice field, had a serious injury last September before Penn State even got into Big Ten action. It cost him the rest of the season. He's now a redshirt sophomore. And let's remember, he was the guy who emerged from preseason camp last summer as RB3 behind Nick Singleton and Katron Allen. Those two guys didn't go anywhere. But now that Wallace is able to get some work with his new running backs coach, Stan Drayton, this creates a new dynamic to what should be a really compelling position battle in the coming months, Mark Brennan.
Yeah, I mean, I think I don't know if I can show it here, but one of the cool things is look at his legs, no braces or anything. We heard that it was pretty serious injuries to both legs. So the fact that he's out there running around, I think, is a good sign. And you just talk about the depth that they have at that position now. It's unbelievable. Obviously, you have two of the best running backs in the nation, but to add him back this soon, and I think being able to get him on the field at all, he was doing kind of, I don't want to say going through the motions. That's the wrong way to put it. Dan, you were over there watching it, but it was a lot of what he was doing was kind of half speed, which is perfectly fine. I mean, you want to take it easy with a guy coming back from injury, but the simple fact of getting back on the field and getting back involved, I think, is big for him going into summer workouts. I don't think you're going to see him playing this weekend, but the fact that he's going to be able to do things, whether it's out on the field in 7-on-7 stuff or, whatever informal passing drills they do, I think is big for him. And I think it's big for that room too. I mean, there's going to be serious competition for that RB3 with the two kids who came in last year, and we're hearing good things about Tyke. So a lot of competition in that room.
Yeah, Tyke Hayes is the freshman. We'll get to him again in a little while here on the show, but you've got the two redshirt freshmen in Quentin Martin Jr. and Corey Smith. And oh, by the way, got another freshman running back making the move in Jabri Wallace-Coleman from Philadelphia this summer. Stan Drayton, the new man in charge of that room. Daniel, anything else to add on Cam Wallace since you were there, really taking the notes on what you witnessed from him on Wednesday? You had the story up at Lions247 last night. And we just got to acknowledge it was a pretty scary situation. I think he has scored his first touchdown in the same game, and within an hour or so he's being carried off the field. He can't put any weight on either leg, and it's almost like this guy stepped on a landmine or something. It was a really kind of disturbing post-injury scene for Cam Wallace. So tell us what you saw in the latest look at him.
Yeah, it's kind of similar to what I said about Rucci in terms of you get to this point in the spring and you kind of, write some guys off a little bit. And I think it's a little bit different because he was coming off of something so serious. And I think it's really big for him. Franklin said that I think this was basically a second practice. And if I read what Franklin said correctly. And so to have him, getting ramped up again, getting his feet wet, kind of like what Mark said, it, looked like he was going, maybe half speed, but you're seeing him cut, you're seeing him do the exact same thing that all the other running backs are doing. And he still looks good physically. He was someone that came in and really had to transform his body. I think he was one of those guys who comes in at, in the 170s. And then, after, however many months with Chuck Losey, suddenly they're, in the upper 190s, over 200 pounds. And I think that, to see him still look good physically, to see how built he is, I think that's a positive. It's going to be interesting. I mean, that running back line is so long now. And you think about, in the past when, in like 2022, when you had so much attrition there and some injuries and, guys that you were kind of like, if Nick Singleton gets hurt, this could be dicey. To see how that's been built up. Obviously, getting guys to stick around is a different conversation. Cam Wallace came in with London Montgomery, who's going into year 2 at ECU now. So those dynamics are at play. But I just think that having Cam Wallace in that room, someone who has that experience, someone who impressed last year, that can only be good for Penn State. And it's just really good for Wallace. I mean, like you said, Tyler, that was, it was quite the scene last year after he got hurt, to see him get carried off by 4 teammates, and the, I guess, emotional toll that comes with that. And James Franklin mentioned that, where he said that with some of these injuries, you've got physical, mental, and emotional toll to work through, and that this was one of those injuries that you can't push through it just because of the severity. So to see him be at this point in the year, he's going to get to be ready for summer. I think it's important for him, really personally.
Yeah, that injury occurred in a 56-0 win over Kent State, again, before they got going with Big Ten play. Cam Wallace had 9 carries on the road at West Virginia week 1, 9 carries against Kent State, including his first touchdown, before being sidelined the rest of the way. So that'll be fun to follow. We know Nick Singleton and Katron Allen will be preparing for the NFL draft this time next year, but in the modern college football era, it's almost impossible to see the other 5 guys that we know are going to be in that room in 2025 still being in that room when spring ball opens next year. It's just kind of the way the world works right now, in every position room. We had an opportunity to hear from Andy Kotelnicki on Wednesday evening, the first time in a while, and he's somebody who had some flirtations with a power conference head coaching jobs. West Virginia was one that was really reportedly out there for a while last December. Didn't end up happening. He's now a year 2 play caller for Penn State. We talked about it since he was hired, expecting him to ultimately get opportunities to be a head coach and ultimately take it at some point. But he's invested trying to maximize this opportunity with the senior quarterback. And let's start there, Mark, the fact that they had this continuity. Last spring was about kind of getting everybody on the same page, introducing them to new concepts. Now you've got a quarterback who's lived through it for a season. You've got an experienced offensive line. You've got 2 senior running backs, some new pieces at wide receiver that we'll get to. But what kind of message did Andy Kotelnicki send on Wednesday regarding that kind of continuation process versus starting from scratch?
Yeah, I'm so far removed from my college days that when he said we were already operating at a 400 level on day 1, I had to kind of think, what did that mean? And it's like, oh, yeah, it's a more advanced level when you start taking it to more advanced level. But he said they should be. They went through 16 games, and they're bringing back all these players. So I think he feels that they're in a good spot. One of the things that I like that he said is he was asked about where the running game can go. And he said the next step is to be dominant. And so when you're talking about a ground game that had the first time in school history, they had 2 1,000-yard rushers in the same season, albeit with an extended season, but still impressive nonetheless. And you're talking about getting even better. To me, that is what makes great teams. You don't settle on your laurels. Yes, you have to address the issues that you have at wide receiver, and we'll get into that. But, he talked about how they're still excellent at tight end. He talked about Drew Aller being as mobile as he's seen him in the 16 months or however long it's been that he's been here, and about everybody else improving. And obviously you can't forget about how good the offensive line is. James Franklin and Kotelnicki were both raving about the offensive line. So when you're taking that approach, that you had one of the best running games in the nation last year and two of the best running backs and one of the best offensive lines, and you want to get even better, I think that's a great way to handle it. The other thing he said that I thought was pretty cool, he talked about Khalil Dinkins being one of the unsung heroes last year, but didn't get the credit that he deserved. And that obviously wasn't for his pass catching. I mean, not that he didn't catch some passes and do a decent job there, but his ability to function in that run game, I think a lot of us overlooked. If Andy Kotelnicki saying that, I didn't really realize it at the time. I probably should have been paying closer attention. But if AK is saying that at this point, you know that they went back and went through all of the tape with a fine-tooth comb. And that was one thing that stood out to him, if he's going out of his way to say that. So not resting on any laurels, I think that's important. But listen, they have to get that wide receiver situation buttoned up, because we saw last year, the ground game can only take you so far. I mean, you can't just have that. You need consistency in the receiving game, and I think that's the next step for this offense.
Yeah, and I think that when you talk about Dinkins, and that's when I came up with Ty Howell on a call last week, or not on a call, on the practice field last week. Tight ends coach for Penn State, went out and was part of the process of bringing Dinkins into the program several years ago. And he says he's developed into a real physical beast, a guy that is going to get the job done in the run game and the pass game as a blocker. And we also heard Drew Aller go out of his way earlier this week to really spotlight that piece of Khalil Dinkins' tool bag. I think a lot of us remember when he got to campus and it was like, is this guy a receiver? Is he a tight end? Is he a safety? Is he a linebacker? Where is he? He's really embraced what it means to be a tight end at this level in this program. And he's somebody that I think a lot of people are kind of looking past because of what else is in that room at younger levels on that ladder. This guy's not going to be elbowed out of the way for anyone.
I'll bet you he hears it too. I'll bet you he hears it. Yeah.
I mean, I'm guilty. I think the last time I went and talked to Khalil Dinkins after practice, most of the things I talked about him were about younger, exciting pieces in the tight end room rather than himself. And so he has a real opportunity here to go make some things happen as a lead figure in that room, and maybe as an important part of this offense in 2025. And the QB2 conversation, I want to just pick that up with you too before I get some thoughts on Daniel, because he watched both those guys in action yesterday. But Mark, what did Kotelnicki have in terms of perspective on Jackson Smollett coming off the injury last year, getting a bunch of work this spring ball, and then Ethan Grunkemeyer, now the red shirt freshman who took a snap or two during the playoff run?
Give me 1 second here. Talk to Daniel for a second. Is that overbearing, or can you guys hear it?
I can't hear much on your end.
Okay, all right. It's kind of overbearing here, but we're having some lawn work done outside. The first time all spring, it happens to be in this window. But he said they threw an awful lot at both guys in the spring, and you would think that. And when we were out on the practice field, what would we see? We would see Aller kind of working out. I don't want to say on his own, but you could tell he was getting a different kind of teaching than those two were getting, and rightfully so. I mean, he's more, and this is one of the things that Kotelnicki said. At this point, Aller's more about refining everything. The other two guys are the guys battling for QB2, Smolik and Grunk. They're about absorbing everything still. They're still getting to that point. And I think the fact that they were able to throw a lot of different things at them this spring was big for both of them. I don't imagine that this is going to be settled by any stretch of the imagination until probably the week before the opener, even if it is settled before the week. But I don't know that anything we saw out on the practice field led us to believe one was significantly ahead of the other. Early on in spring drills, it looked like Grunk was usually the second guy kind of in line, but that could have been because Smolik was coming back from an injury. Then Grunk was bumped up, I think it was last week, and we were seeing a little bit more Smolik. So I think you're going to see that go kind of back and forth. But what he was getting at is that they were able to throw a lot of different things at these two kids during the spring, and it was important for both, and both did well. And he talked about Beckham Kritza, as well. And just for him, he's at an even different level coming in. But one of the things he said about Kritza is being able to get a kid in at mid-year as a quarterback. And we've seen him do that with all these quarterbacks, or most of these quarterbacks in recent years. Being able to get a kid at mid-year is huge, especially somebody who came in at 140 pounds or whatever Kritza was, to get him bigger and stronger and to start absorbing that offense. they're probably not going to need Beckham Kritza this year. But the fact that he was able to be here in the spring, if an emergency pops up where they do need him, at least he'll have gone through a spring practice and have a better grasp of things.
We've acknowledged here plenty of times he's a project. We haven't been putting him in that QB2 conversation. Really curious to see what he can do in terms of
potential high upside. Yeah,
fundamental growth here in the next 8 months of his life here in State College. I don't think we have to worry about him being involved in game action and thing unless things go very awry for the plan for Penn State. Daniel, you did watch both of those guys in practice action on Wednesday. Anything to offer on Smolik and Grunkemeyer? And this is always a really interesting storyline of the blue-white game, right? The backup quarterback situation a couple years ago. It was our first chance to look at Drew Aller. I know my first event I ever covered as a Penn State reporter, the 2017 spring game, people were going nuts about Tommy Stevens after it because he put up some big performances. But what do you make of these two, what you saw, and what they can gain from going out in front of a Beaver Stadium crowd and putting together a good afternoon? Because let's face it, even Grunkemeyer's first brush with Beaver Stadium crowd didn't go so well against SMU.
Yeah, I think you look at both of them, and they're still a little bit of unknown commodities in terms of what they can do in Beaver Stadium. We've been watching these guys for a long time. When you factor in camps, all these practices, different showcases, with Grunkemeyer, seeing him play a game in person. But it's different when the lights are on, when it's a Saturday in Happy Valley or wherever in the Big Ten. And so I think the more that we can see these guys in sort of real game environments, even if it's simulated, the better understanding that we can get. Andy Kotelnicki said that they put a lot of stress on them in terms of situational work to see how they would respond. And then also, I think the intangible stuff we've heard about both of them has really been positive across the board. We heard really good things about Smolik when he was sidelined last year, what he was doing in terms of the quizzes that Danny O'Brien would give them, before games as part of that preparation. Even though he wasn't on the practice field or, playing, he was still competing in that regard. And then with Grunkemeyer, he just has a bit of an unflappability to him. I think he's always come across as really composed. Obviously, when he got out there against SMU, things went a little awry early. But he was someone that, talking to him before the Fiesta Bowl, talking to him back in February, he seems to really understand and have a good, sense of himself in terms of what he can do and how he approaches things. And, physically, I mean, they both look good. They're different quarterbacks. Grunkemeyer is a little bit lankier, taller. He can really whip it. I think it's that, some of the things we see on social media from what Brad Mendler does in terms of training these guys out in Ohio. But then Smolik throws just a really pretty ball. And that's something that I think I've been pointing it out for 2 years in terms of warm-ups before these games, is that, he can really loft it up the sideline. Guys can really run under that ball. I know James Franklin mentioned it at some point. I forget when exactly it all runs together, but he complimented Smolik for that aspect of his game. I just think they're two really solid backups right now, and we'll see which one emerges as that number two. And then if things go as you expect them to go in the non-con, they can get some valuable reps. But I think Penn State, the quarterback room is in a nice spot right now.
You got a maximum of 17 games left with your starter, Drew Aller, who's a senior now. And then Ethan Grunkemeyer has one pass completion for 9 yards and one interception at the college level. Jackson Smolik does not have a pass attempt at the college level. And I just think it's good. This is a glorified practice. We know that. We all acknowledge that. But you put a little bit of pressure and dynamics. It's not televised, but you got fans around. You've got reporters watching you for an extended period. And there's just a little bit different riding on this particular practice session for these two quarterbacks, at least in terms of public perception, because you go out there, you have a rough afternoon. A lot of people are going to label you being that guy based off of one practice because it was open to the public. I don't think we'll do that. But that's kind of the game you play when you're a backup quarterback and you get a chance to go in and play in a spring game. You can be defined by that moment. So we'll see what those guys bring to the field. And we'll also see what Kritza can do and probably some limited work out there as well. Linebacker, that group is getting light. We haven't seen Tony Rojas or Zachary Nelson this spring involved on the field. Both those guys working on some recovery. We don't think that's a long-term issue, but it has been an issue in terms of how many guys are out there involved in each practice. And then Tamir Robinson, who was leading linebacker lines last week, was not out there with the linebackers now. He's committed to USC. He's going to be a Trojan this upcoming season. And additionally, you lost Beckham D, a walk-on linebacker, and they don't have a ton of those walk-on linebackers on the roster anymore. So it's a group that's dwindling before our eyes on the practice field, but there are some things to like about it. Obviously, Dom DeLuca has done a lot for you. He's now the guy leading the lines. You've got Keon Wiley, who is getting 15 practices under his belt this spring after missing all of last season. He's going to finish this camp a lot better situated than he did coming into it. But the two names, guys, that I keep coming back to are Anthony Specca, who Dan Connor raved about after practice on Wednesday in terms of his growth from year 1 to year 2. We've heard a lot about his instinctual success as well on the spring practice field from Jim Knowles, defensive coordinator. And then Kari Jackson, the other second-year linebacker, also took a red shirt last year, but under different circumstances. Specca was waiting in the wings, kind of ready for his moment at practice throughout the fall. Kari Jackson was injured in August, missed the entire season being sidelined, and he also missed nearly his entire senior high school season. So Kari Jackson is someone we're getting feedback on in terms of finishing plays with authority, being a bit of a thumper, which was kind of his trademark at the high school level up in Michigan. He's somebody that very north-south pound you kind of linebacker, and he's worked on losing some weight, getting a little bit more versatility to his game, getting lateral. But Mark, Daniel, someone's got to step up in this room. And I know a lot of people are gravitating towards LeVar Arrington II because of his name. He does some special things. Maybe he'll do some special things Saturday. But I think the more short-term conversation here, at least preparing for kickoff in 2025, Mark, would probably center on those two second-year linebackers, what they can accomplish, even when Tony Rojas and Dakari Nelson are back in the fold.
Yeah, I know when we had a chance to talk to Jim Knowles last week, was it? Yeah, my weeks are running together here. And I asked about who were some of the people who were kind of standing out at linebacker. Specca was the first person that he mentioned, which I think is a pretty good sign. You guys remember when we saw him at team camp, and I was super impressed. A lot of times at these team camps, linebackers are like a non-factor because you don't run the ball at the 7-on-7 camps. I guess I should have explained that 7-on-7. But he was really good in coverage. I mean, like for a high school linebacker, I was like blown away by how good this kid was in coverage. And I mention that because to me, that has to be the most difficult thing for these linebackers to learn coming in at the college level. And I think kind of being ahead of the game a little bit has really helped him. Has it helped him enough to be ready to be a key player this year? I think we're going to find out because I think he's going to have to. So I know way more about him than I do about Jackson, but to me, Specca seems to be a guy who is trending towards having a significant role at linebacker.
Daniel and I were talking about this after practice, and you start to say who are the top 3 or 4 guys clustered in that group toward the top right now at linebacker, and we thought Tamir Robinson was going to be one of those. He is not anymore. It certainly feels like Specca is, and whether it's the confidence from Dan Connor, his position coach, Jim Knowles, we heard some really strong things from James Franklin as well. But you got to remember, this is his first spring camp, and we even heard last summer in preseason camp that he was a guy who was ahead of the curve. So what would he have been able to maybe do as a freshman if he had a full year on campus versus getting to campus in summer? Who knows? But now that he's been around for almost a full year, I think he got here last May, it's very apparent that they feel like they got a strong fit at linebacker from that last class. And there is some I should say positive trends with Kari Jackson. There was a time last year where you wondered, man, Kari Jackson, back-to-back years being sidelined, what does this mean for his development? Well, he's come out the other side. It's been pretty positive. So keep an eye on number 30 and number 40 in Beaver Stadium on Saturday. I think they're both going to get a lot of run. They could be very important pieces for this Penn State team. And remember, as you're watching the linebackers work through things, no Dakari Jackson, no Tony Rojas, a bit of an incomplete process. And those freshmen, Alex Taish and LeVar Arrington Jr. will continue to get reps under their belt. And they'll be joined by Cam Smith out of Philadelphia's St. Joe's this summer in that linebacker room. Daniel, let's finish on our practice review with your thoughts on receivers. You had a chance to break them down a bit in your offensive notebook yesterday. We're going to talk about 2 of them in particular here in a moment because we heard from Devontae Ross and Kyron Hudson, the transfer pickups for the first time since they got to campus. But what were your takeaways during our last look at Penn State on its practice field?
Yeah, I think that this wide receiver group, obviously it's going to be at a point where they are going to need to prove it to a lot of people to have trust in this group and what they can do. But you look at it, and I think that there are some intriguing pieces right now. You talk about Devontae Ross and Kyron Hudson. Those two guys obviously are at the top of the list because we, haven't seen them. We don't necessarily know what they can do on, a night in, night out basis in the Big Ten. But then I think that there's value to having Liam Clifford in year 5. I think there's value to having Caden Saunders healthy in year 4. Those are guys who have been around, have seen a lot of things. Obviously, you would like to see more on more impact on the field, but you can't really, I guess, undervalue depth in that perspective sometimes. And then you have another group of guys that are kind of unknowns, maybe higher ceilings. Like what can you get from Tyseer Denmark in year 2? What can one of these freshmen, Matt Alton, Lyric Samuel, Kobe Howard, can they find some sort of role? I think that Penn State has done for all the perception, I guess, of issues in terms of recruiting and whatnot. I think in terms of body types, playing styles, all of that, I think you have some complementary pieces that can fit together really well. And it does seem like that the coaching from Marcus Hagans is taking hold a little bit. But it's really just going to come down to that, let's get to Saturdays in September and really know. But I think that this could potentially be a group that gets out there on Saturday and makes a good impression on people. And you think about 2 years ago, Omari Evans had a really nice day and really teased things out. He raised those expectations for himself. The fall didn't necessarily follow up on that. But you were able to see that potential and see a skill set from a guy that is unique and that you can imagine inside of an offense. So I think for some of these younger Penn State wide receivers or the new ones, I think that that's going to be I don't know if a key is the right word for Saturday, but really something to follow along with over the afternoon.
If I recall correctly, last year, the spring game where I think one team didn't even score. I don't know if it was blue or white, but they were shut out. And then Quentin Martin, the freshman running back, scored the 2 touchdowns for the game. I remember Harrison Wallace, having a series of receptions from Drew Aller. And we were like, those two are, they're back at it again, picking up where they left off in the Peach Bowl. I don't really remember anything else about a receiver from that game, though. So
it was more about who wasn't there. That was the
Keandre Lambert-Smith had hit the exit door, and that was a big storyline. But this feels a lot different, and I think if we walk away and we don't have much to talk about at receiver, probably going to be a bit of a red flag. I know we have respect for the defensive backs. I know we understand it's going to be a bit vanilla in terms of scheme in this setting, but you want to see guys make some contested catches. You want to see some bursts, some flash from this group, and you hope that it's kind of across those different levels of the room like you talked about. Guys who've been around the program, veteran transfers who just joined the program, and then these young talents that we're wondering are going to surface over the course of this 2025 season. So we'll keep tabs on that group. And when it comes to Devontae Ross and Kyron Hudson, we did get a chance to hear from them a bit. We'll have content over at Lions247.com. But I'll just say Kyron Hudson making the move across the country after playing at USC, after playing Southern California, powerhouse, modern day, very much motivated by chasing a national championship. I think that was pretty clear in what both of the guys had to say. But Hudson is somebody who, he talked about watching Drew Aller warm up before that USC matchup last year in the Coliseum. He's like, you can see that guy has serious arm talent. And he said that getting used to being a target for him now on the practice field has been a real pleasure, he thinks, for both parties. And he talked about how contested catches keep popping up when you discuss Kyron Hudson with anybody within the program. And we remember that great one-handed grab going airborne against LSU last year. He said that's just always been a natural part of his football DNA, that aggressive nature, going up and grabbing the ball. And in terms of family and proximity here, because it's a big difference for him being in central Pennsylvania versus Southern California. He's got mom and dad flying into town. They'll be in Beaver Stadium this Saturday. And he says they have planned monthly visits to be here and check in with him. And so he's feeling good about that. He's feeling more and more comfortable. And this is a guy who was a starter in the Big Ten last year for USC. And you'd expect production right off the jump for him. What did you learn a bit from Devontae Ross? Because that's where you were parked for part of our post-practice interview session.
Yeah, I think from Devontae Ross, it was a similar thing in terms of being able to compete at the highest level. Obviously, it's a little different when you talk. That context is a little bit different. Someone coming up from Troy as opposed to someone coming over from USC. But he wants to prove himself at this level. He talked about the game at Iowa last year, which James Franklin has brought up, and said that was a pretty big deal for him and what he was able to accomplish. He's from Georgia, played at Troy, said he's still getting used to the weather a little bit. And as we've talked about these past couple of months, probably a little bit of whiplash from someone coming up from the South. But he was asked about what has been mentioned, from Chuck Losey, about having the resources. And he said that it's been great in terms of having, the nutrition staff, the strength staff, the support staff, everything that goes into changing yourself physically and what goes into that. He sounded very, very appreciative of having that opportunity and using that as a building block. So I think that's what you want to see when someone comes up from this level. He's someone that we've seen these glimpses of him in practice. We can see that short area quickness. We can see some of that burst. What's it going to look like against some of these Penn State DBs? I think that's the bigger question for us, to see that over a more extended period of time. But I think early returns with what he said, his approach, what we've seen, what we've heard, have been positive for Devontae Ross.
Ross is also an accomplished punt returner, but that's not really something that we're going to get to see play out in live action over the course of Saturday. But that is certainly something to stash away when Penn State hits the regular season. Mark, we've covered the new wide receivers from the freshmen to the transfers, and we've got a few other newcomers that we've hit on during the course of this conversation, like LeVar Arrington and Beckham Kritza. Who are some other guys, whether it's transfer or freshman, that you're particularly curious to get a longer look at when we're in the stadium on Saturday?
I just want to, you guys were talking about Amari Evans last year. The all-time great blue white game performance by a wide receiver was Tikas Pettigrew in 1997. He had 2 touchdown catches. He was a highly regarded prospect. Everybody thought he was going to set the world on fire. He ended up with 7 catches in his career and moved to defensive back. So you never know what's going to happen.
Can I add one? Didn't Mac Hippenhammer have a 2-touchdown day in a spring game one time? And
yeah, he had a great rushing game. He was a walk-on. He wasn't necessarily as highly recruited as Tikas Pettigrew, but those are some, like when you have the Mount Rushmore of the blue-white game, I think you would have like Tikas, Mac Hippenhammer, maybe Jerry Collins, and I'm trying to figure out who else.
I got a name for you. Dan Chisena caught like a 50-yard touchdown pass from Will Levis, and then James Franklin announced to Beaver Stadium that he was on scholarship. By the way, he's like a 7-year NFL veteran now.
Right, but he ended up going on to enjoy success at the next level. The people who typically were the stars of these games were ones, with all due respect to them, because a lot of them were walk-ons who worked really hard, and it's good to see them get that opportunity. But no, I'm anxious to see what Olish looks like. I mean, to me, we've talked so much about this tight end room, but when we've seen him, he just looks like a natural, fluid receiver out there. Mm-hmm. And I'd like to see how he kind of stacks up, blocking and doing some of those other things. I know we're going to get into blue-white game format, but I think the fact that it looks like they're going to be playing at least a couple of quarters, if not more, live, hitting. That's going to be the part that I think I'm going to be watching the most, to see what some of these young players are all about. I'll go back to receiver just because they need a receiver, and I want to see what these freshmen are all about. Kobe Howard and Otten, they've been getting a lot of buzz, and for the first time yesterday, Franklin talked about Lyric Samuel. I don't think Lyric Samuel is going to be a guy who projects to play a lot this year because he's just physically skinny. But when we've been at practice, he's looked good. I mean, and again, we're not seeing live scrimmage drills, so we're seeing him go through. But some of the things
he goes up, he gets it. He goes and gets the ball.
Yeah, I mean, that's what I mean. It's like when you're watching, you could tell guys who kind of have that it factor. And again, I don't know that it's going to be this year with that kid, but I think he's going to kind of be he's going to be going places. And the TJ Shanahan, I mean, I want to see what he's all about. I wonder how many snaps he's going to get. He's a kind of a veteran, but what is he kind of all about, and will he fit in? Could he help make up for the loss of JB Nelson? So those are some of the guys I'm looking for on offense. And I think over on defense, I may be tipping my hand a little bit here, but I'm anxious to see what the 2 linebackers we talked about are all about. I mean, these guys are going to be forced into action, Specca and Jackson, and how are they able to handle that situation? This probably is getting loud now, isn't it, or is it not?
You're good.
Okay, this is crazy. This microphone must be working really well because it is like super duper loud out there. So those are some of the guys, and then maybe some of the young defensive backs.
Daniel, I'll toss it over to you, and then whatever you don't mention, I'll maybe pick up some of those pieces. I'll just mention going to play. I don't think he's going to be playing much, right? A preseason All-American type at guard, a guy who's played a ton of football for you. Again, a lot of the starters reps are not going to match up with backup reps in the blue-white game. That's the way this kind of plays out year to year. And I think we'll see quite a bit of TJ Shanahan. And by the way, Lyric Samuel, I don't know what his wingspan is, but he's about 6'4", but he's probably got like a 6'6", 6'7" wingspan. Yeah. And when he is somebody who has that inclination to go up and get the football, I mean, he looks like someone going up and rebounding the basketball or slamming the ball down. Really impressive. Go up and get it at that size. So, Daniel, what do we miss? What are you looking at? Who do you want to see more of on Saturday?
I'll start on the defensive line. Ivan Kamaju, the freshman defensive end, Randy Adarica, the freshman defensive tackle. Both of them have picked up some buzz. I think Franklin has called Adarica, I think a couple times, he's called him a pleasant surprise. And that's something that we talk about with these guys in the trenches, where you don't necessarily know right away how they're going to take to it. There is a pretty big physical learning curve there, and there's some development that, especially in the weight room, that needs to be done to contribute. But, Max Granville had some good things to say about Adarica and what he brings. And so I'm curious what that looks like. We know how much Penn State lost at defensive tackle from last year. And we know there's guys in there that need to step up when you talk about the redshirt, that group of redshirt freshmen from last year. So I think that Adarica is someone that I'll have an eye on. He's number 52 for everyone at home. And then Kamaju, Deion Barnes got asked a couple questions about him on Wednesday night and said that he's one of those guys that can really flip a switch when he's on the field, that in the meeting room and just in terms of how he goes about things, he's really mild-mannered, really smart kid, really, I think, well-regarded for work in the classroom, all of that. But when he gets on the football field, that something changes and that he's that type of player. And I think that's something that you like to hear when you're talking about a defensive end or just a defensive lineman in general. So I'm curious how that plays, what that looks like. And on offense, I'll leave Tyke Hayes to you, Tyler, since you've been piloting that train for a little bit. But yeah, I mean, I'm excited. I'm interested in Beckham Kritza. We got some extended exposure to him at camps last year. And I think that we talked about it where, we sort of got it more after seeing him. We can kind of see what Penn State sees in him. We have a couple months of on the record feedback in terms of how Penn State feels about him, how they've seen him come along. Chuck Losey talked about him basically being a blank slate that they are going to build. We know how much weight they expect him to gain. And so I want to see, how different is this kid now in April 2025 versus May 2024 when we saw him at Elite 11, and then again in June 2024 when we saw him at one of the showcase camps. What can we see from the development, and does he look like he belongs out there, at least from the arm strength and how he's going about things.
Yeah, having to disseminate the information from the coaching staff to 10 other guys on the offensive field in front of a crowd in Beaver Stadium while facing 11 college defenders. That's something we have not seen from Beckham Kritza. And remember, it was a bit of a rocky road for him. He ended up on a state championship team as a senior, but transferred schools midway through his senior year down in South Florida, ended up not really being the primary quarterback at times. So we'll see what it looks like for him. And I will go back to Tyke Hayes since you set me up there. I think we need to be paying attention to him very seriously for that RB3 job. There's going to be a competition for months ahead and maybe throughout the entire year ahead. But this is a guy who came to campus and the staff was sold on him before he got to campus. They considered him, among all the players they signed, one of the more under the radar type talents in the class when they matched up what they thought about him with what recruiting services ranked him as, where the buzz was with this class. They didn't feel enough of that was placed on Tyke Hayes. And he showed up to campus. I've talked about it physically. His lower body is just different than a lot of the guys in the team, including Nick Singleton and Katron Allen. And he's not thin up top, and he can pull off a spin move. He's got some lateral quickness that you probably wouldn't anticipate from just seeing him on the eye test. And I want to see what it looks like when they're doing some of the 7-on-7 action early. How does he look as a receiver? Does he look natural as a receiver? How does he look in dealing with a blitz pickup in the backfield to protect the quarterback? Those are the things that we don't necessarily think about with running backs, but that's really determines whether or not they're going to be seeing the field, especially as a freshman player. So Hayes is someone I want to watch closely. Wouldn't surprise me at all if he ends up, being near or at the lead in terms of carries on the entire day. I think we're going to see a lot of carry spread. I don't think we're going to see a lot of work going to Nick Singleton and Katron Allen. And then over on defense, I would say Darius Dixon continues to be someone that we hear is on that green light type of path. And we know that there's been plenty of freshmen who've burned their red shirt in Terry Smith's cornerback room. This is a guy who, like Kyron Hudson, comes from that Southern California powerhouse in modern day. He knows what the national stage looks like, not quite at this level, but I think he's in a position to maybe be, a fifth cornerback for this team as they get ready for the fall. And so somebody else to watch. And the last name I'll throw out there, we got a lot of dudes to keep an eye on at tackle. Again, not sure that we'll actually see Nolan Rucci involved, but Owen Alicine, would normally be finishing up his high school career. Instead, enrolled early, came to campus. He's probably still shy of 280 pounds, but he's bringing it on the football field. He is really impressed in some of those one-on-one matchups. Not that we've seen a bunch, but in talking to people, with some of these edge defenders that Penn State can throw your way, he's found a way to battle, counter, and win some of those matchups. And ultimately, he's somebody that Phil Troutline was just really excited to discuss a couple weeks ago, and we had a chance to do that after practice. So Alicine, we've been seeing him work as a left tackle for the majority of our looks at practice. What does it look like here very early on when he's got to deal with those pass rushers, move guys for the run game? And so those are some of the newcomers I'll be keeping tabs on. And in terms of a format, Daniel, there's not a ton to go down the road here, but just let our listeners know what the plan is. James Franklin laid it out a bit for us on Wednesday evening.
Yeah, earlier this spring, James Franklin said that quarters might be a little shorter, shorter or no halftime. I think that one of the goals is to keep the action on the field moving, keep fans in the stands, keep them engaged, all those sorts of things. Last night he said that that's going to be traditional. Like, it's going to be sort of what we've seen in the past. They're going to start with 2 periods of, Skelly, which is what you normally see while they're warming up. That's some 7-on-7, for the skill players, linemen doing pass protection drills, some individual stuff. Then it's going to be 4 quarters, like a normal game. First quarter, he said, is going to be thud, which means that, they'll, basically tap each other, or, they'll make contact. They won't go to the ground. He said that that's so that everyone can get involved. I know we've talked about some of the guys that they're managing, or someone might only be doing a little bit of work. That's an opportunity for them to get into the action. Then final 3 quarters will be live, which is that traditional, I think, game that we've seen these past couple of years. We haven't heard anything as of 1:20 on April 24th. I'll open the email really quick. Nothing in there, about scoring.
Or rosters.
Or rosters. So stay tuned for that. But it does sound like that, in a world where, teams are doing all these different things for spring games or not having one, Penn State, at least the way they're framing it, the way they're talking, it's going to be a pretty traditional blue-white game at Beaver Stadium.
Hey, we'll get some scrimmage action. That's something that we don't get much in terms of media looks. I know fans appreciate that. You'll get some tackling. You won't see sacks, I don't think, unless someone makes a huge mistake on defense and brings down a quarterback. But to Daniel's point, some guys will be involved for the first quarter of practice. Then they'll step aside because of some physical limitations. And there's a bunch of guys, Denai Dennis, Antonio Rojas among them, that we just don't think are going to be available for this team come Saturday, because we haven't seen them available on the practice field. But this team will be back in Beaver Stadium. We'll see whoever they roll out there on the field, and we'll report back to you at Lions247.com. Let's finish on a fun note here. It's always an absolutely ridiculous experiment for the spring game, but predicting MVPs. We don't know what the rosters look like, but we can have some fun throwing at the dartboard here. Mark, why don't you give us your MVP predictions for offense, defense, and then we'll go to Daniel for his.
All right, I'm going to switch up on defense. And just because you said that they don't have sacks, I'm going to go with Max Granville, because they do have sacks. They just have to be tagged down. And how many times in this game have we seen a guy get 3 or 4 sacks when he maybe have had 1 or none, just because the quarterbacks only have to be tagged to be down? So I'll go with Max Granville, the promising defensive end, who by rights could still be in high school at this moment. I mean, that's absolutely insane to think about. And then I'm going to go back to running back. We mentioned, I think, every running back on the roster in this thing, except for Corey Smith. This is a competitive kid. I think this is a big game for these backup running backs. That may sound ridiculous, but the ability to get out there, I think every opportunity you have to set yourself apart in that battle for running back 3, I think is important. So I think maybe one of those guys will elevate a little bit, and I think Corey Smith makes up for that long run that didn't quite reach the end zone. He'll get a long touchdown run somewhere, and Corey Smith, running back from Wisconsin, is going to be my offensive MVP, the Tikas Pettigrew offensive MVP of the Blue-White game.
Couple redshirt freshman picks there from Mark. What do you have for us, Daniel?
Yeah, I'm going to say on offense, Devontae Ross. We know the skill set that he has, and that he can make some splash plays for you. We'll see how they set up the teams. I know, Tyler, you and I talked about this, where you think you go back to last year, AJ Harris and Jalen Kimber were on, I forget if it was blue or white, but they were basically on the second team. They were not on the incumbent team. And then fast forward to the fall, those are your starters. So we don't know if Devontae Ross will be, catching passes from, or be going up against the ones defensively. But I just think that he has that big play ability, get the ball in his hands, something can happen. And then also we know that James Franklin is aware of what people say, and, aware of this kind of stage. So if they get the opportunity to chuck it deep to Devontae Ross a couple times, I could see him having, 1 or 2 long touchdowns over the course of Saturday. Maybe, announce Drew Aller as a downfield thrower, announce this offense, announce these wide receivers, send a little bit of a message.
So your bold prediction is the receivers will have at least 1 catch in this game.
Yes.
As opposed to the last time we saw this team.
I was going to save that prediction for Nevada as my bold prediction, but we can get that out of the way now. And switching over to the defense, someone we talked about a lot. I went with Anthony Specca. I think that there's going to be a lot of opportunities for these linebackers. I think that Mark talked about this being a big game for some of these backup running backs. Like, I don't think we're going to see that much Nick Singleton and Katron Allen. So I think you're going to see hard running from a Quentin Martin, from a Corey Smith, from a Tyke Hayes, Tyler Holsworth, Emil Davis, and then we'll see how a guy like Anthony Specca can stand up to that. What does he look like? As he's also trying to prove himself. I think that when you get into some of these, second teamers that are going to have elevated roles because of, the machinations of this, I think you're going to see some hard-nosed play. And I think that's where Specca can really shine.
I'm going to circle back to the freshman running back, Tyke Hayes. Again, I don't know what the carries will look like, but if he ends up somewhere in 8 to 12 carry range on the day, I think he's going to do something with those carries. I guess that could also depend on which offensive line he ends up behind, considering how this roster could get split up. But last year we saw the freshman running back involved out there, Quentin Martin Jr., have 2 of the splashier plays in the field, 2 touchdown runs. Maybe he finds the end zone a couple times, churns out 60, 70 yards with his opportunities, it rips off a nice run, maybe makes a man miss, and then shoves another guy down. I think we'll be talking about Tyke Hayes in a very positive way coming off the field Saturday. And so I'll go all in and just say he's my MVP pick. And then defensively, we've been talking about newcomers and young players. I'm going to go with a 4th-year veteran on this team and a former walk-on, Colin Dinkins. He had a really good spring game last year. And he had a really strong spring game. And it kind of capped off what we heard was a strong spring ball for him. He was playing safety last year. He's now playing cornerback. But where I'm eyeing him at in this situation is he might be the first man up in that 5th defensive back role on Saturday, because there hasn't been any King Mack on the football field the last several weeks. We have not seen Zion Tracy the last few weeks either as being available. And then John Mitchell was also playing in that slot. He hit the transfer portal. So I think there's a real chance to see Colin Dinkins get a large workload as a 5th defensive back playing there. And when you're at the second level, there's also a chance to get in on more action near the line of scrimmage, rack up some tackles. And I'm going to say he'll have his hand in some kind of takeaway. And so Colin Dinkins gets the nod for me on defense. Guys, anything else to add before we close up shop and get ready to get back to Beaver Stadium? And we got to note this. We're just not quite sure what the press box situation is going to look like, because you may have noticed the one that we have resided, Mark, for the last 30 years, me and Daniel a bit shorter. It's no longer in existence. It was thrown to the ground back in December, and it's been swept away.
Well, Tyler, I was going to mention that because you picked Tyke Hayes. I picked Corey Smith. They said there's no cheering allowed in the press box. But are we allowed to cheer from the open seating that we're going to be in 27-mile-an-hour winds?
Yeah, are we allowed to boo? Are we allowed to boo?
No, I mean, in all seriousness, this should be a fun game. I think Dinkins may have played his way out of being an MVP.
Yeah, I think so
Dinkins
too.
only because, but it's I just love the fact that they're still going live.
Mm-hmm.
And that we're going to see some younger players. And one thing I've gotten a lot of questions, how long is Penn State going to keep doing this? I think it's important to note. I think James Franklin is committed to the blue-white game because he knows what it means for the university. He knows what it means for the community, the hotels, the restaurants. He knows what it means for Penn State fans. I don't think they're going to get rid of this thing any way, shape, or form anytime soon. I think it's going to be around. They just may change the way that it's operated and keep it off TV. That seems to be important to them. But I think it's a great event, and I hope they always have it because it's a fun way to wrap up spring practice.
Head over to Lions247.com on Saturday. We'll let you know where we are, and maybe we'll be sitting alongside you in your section, perhaps, in Beaver Stadium. But it should be a fun and enlightening opportunity for us to get a longer look at the Penn State football team before they close up spring camp. Thank you for following our coverage throughout spring camp here on the podcast. Again, last opportunity by Thursday at midnight to jump on board with those VIP deals at Lions247.com. For now, stepping aside, getting back to work on the site. On behalf of Daniel Gallen and Mark Brennan, I'm Tyler Donahue. This has been the Lions247 Podcast.